For nearly a decade, the Central Intelligence Agency hunted for a traitor inside its own walls. They suspected bad luck. They suspected bugged phone lines. They suspected a dozen wrong people. What they never seriously suspected was the man who was helping them look. He sat in on the meetings about the mole hunt. He read the internal reports about the missing agents. He nodded along, offered theories, and went home to a house he had paid for in cash. His name was Aldrich Ames, and by the time anyone caught him, at least 10 people were already dead because of what he had sold. This is the story of how one man, trusted with some of the most sensitive secrets in American intelligence, quietly became the most damaging spy in the history of the CIA, and how he got away with it for almost 9 years, in plain sight, while the people meant to catch him kept looking everywhere but at him. Aldrich Ames joined the CIA in 1962, working part-time while he finished college, and came on full-time a few years later. He was not, by most accounts, a spectacular officer. His performance reviews over the years were mixed, solid analytical instincts, but a reputation for sloppiness, drinking, and a habit of leaving classified material where he shouldn't. None of that mattered as much as it should have, because Ames had something more valuable than a flawless record. He had access. Over more than 2 decades he moved through postings in Turkey, New York, and Mexico City, working counterintelligence against Soviet targets, and in 1983 he was brought back to Washington and made Chief of Counterintelligence for the Soviet and East European Division. That title meant something very specific. It meant Ames was one of the people responsible for identifying Soviet officials secretly working for the United States and protecting their identities. He was briefed on the CIA's most closely guarded operations inside the USSR. He knew which Soviet military officers, KGB officers, and diplomats had been recruited as American assets. He knew their code names, their handlers, their tradecraft. In other words, the CIA had placed one of its most sensitive collections of human secrets directly into the hands of a man who was about to sell every one of them. That's the part of this story that makes it so different from ordinary espionage cases. Ames wasn't a low-level clerk who stumbled across a folder he shouldn't have seen. He was the guy whose entire job was to find people like himself. He understood exactly how counterintelligence investigations worked, what would raise flags, and what wouldn't. That knowledge would let him survive inside the CIA for years after the damage was already done. Consider what the Soviet East European Division actually was during the Cold War. It was the CIA's front line against Moscow, the division responsible for running and protecting the small, precious group of Soviet officials who had agreed to spy for the United States from inside the Kremlin, the military, and the KGB itself. Recruiting even one such source could take years of careful, patient work, cultivating a relationship, building trust, verifying loyalty, protecting identity at every step. These operations were considered among the most sensitive in the entire U.S. government, compartmented and restricted to a small circle of people who absolutely needed to know. Ames was inside that circle. He didn't need to break into a vault or hack a server. He simply had to walk out the door with what was already in his head. By 1983, colleagues and supervisors already had reservations about him. There had been complaints about heavy drinking, about carelessness with sensitive files, about a briefcase left behind in a public place. None of it was treated as disqualifying. In the culture of the CIA at the time, an officer with the right pedigree and the right access could accumulate a surprising number of quiet warning signs without ever facing a serious internal review. That gap between what people noticed and what the institution actually did about it would end up costing lives. By the mid-1980s, Ames's personal life was falling apart. He was drinking heavily. His marriage to his first wife was ending, and the divorce left him in debt. Around the same time, he had begun a relationship with Rosario Casas Dupuy, a cultural attaché he had met through his work in Mexico City, who also had ties to the CIA. Rosario had expensive tastes, and Ames, unwilling to risk losing her, found himself trying to fund a lifestyle his government salary was never built for. He was making around $45,000 a year. He believed he needed close to double that just to keep up. It's a mundane motive for what would become an extraordinary betrayal. Not ideology, not blackmail, not a crisis of conscience about the Cold War. Just money and the fear of losing someone. So, in April of 1985, Ames did something almost absurdly simple. He walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., in broad daylight and offered to sell secrets. No dead drops yet, no elaborate tradecraft. He just walked in the front door. In that first meeting, he handed over the names of Soviet intelligence officers who were secretly working for the FBI. It earned him $50,000. It was a small, almost tentative first step. It would not stay small for long. Within months, Ames escalated dramatically. He began identifying the CIA's most valuable assets inside the Soviet Union, the human sources risking their lives to feed information to the West. On a single occasion in June of 1985, he handed Soviet intelligence a package of documents that, by some estimates, exposed virtually the entire roster of American human intelligence operations against the USSR. He didn't trickle out secrets over years of careful spying. He gave up what amounted to the CIA's entire order of battle inside the Soviet Union almost all at once. In exchange, the payments grew larger. Over the next several years, Ames would be paid more than $2 million by Soviet, and later Russian, intelligence, one of the largest sums Moscow is known to have paid any spy during the Cold War era. Here is why that mattered so much more than an ordinary leak. Every name Ames handed over belonged to a real person embedded inside a hostile security state, someone who had chosen, often at extraordinary personal risk, to work against their own government. These weren't abstract files. They were case officers' careers, and more importantly, they were human lives depending entirely on secrecy holding. And Ames didn't have to guess at any of it. As chief of counterintelligence for the Soviet division, he had been the one entrusted to protect these exact identities. He simply repackaged the CIA's own crown jewels and sold them across the street. The consequences arrived fast. Starting in the summer of 1985, CIA and Allied intelligence assets across the Soviet Union began vanishing. Some were quietly arrested. Others were tried in secret and executed. One of the identified victims was Leonid Poleshchuk, a senior Soviet official who had been secretly working for the CIA under a code name. He was arrested in 1985 and executed the following year. He was far from alone. Investigators would later determine that at least 10 CIA and Allied human sources were executed as a direct result of the information Ames handed over, with dozens more compromised, arrested, or driven out of their positions. Some of these officers had spent years building the trust needed to access Soviet military and political secrets. Within weeks of Ames's meetings with the KGB, that access, and in many cases those lives, were gone. At Langley, the pattern was impossible to ignore for long. Assets that had been reliable for years suddenly stopped reporting. Networks that had taken a decade to build collapsed almost simultaneously. This was not the normal attrition of espionage work, where an occasional source is lost to bad luck or a slip in tradecraft. This looked systemic. By 1986, it was becoming clear inside the CIA that something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the leading theory was the one that should terrify any intelligence service. There was a mole. Someone on the inside was betraying their own sources. What followed was one of the most frustrating chapters in American counterintelligence history. The CIA and FBI launched an internal investigation to find the source of the losses, but for years it went almost nowhere. Investigators considered technical failures, compromised communications, Soviet code breaking, a bugged embassy. They looked at dozens of CIA employees who'd had access to the compromised operations. The mole hunt dragged on through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, and it's a brutal irony of this case that, for a stretch of that time, Ames himself was pulled into the effort to figure out who the mole was. The man responsible for the leaks was, at moments, sitting in the room helping decide who else might be responsible. It's hard to imagine a more complete failure of an internal security system, and it's exactly why this case would later force the CIA to rebuild how it screens and monitors its own people. For years, investigators chased the wrong theories, and in doing so, they cost other people dearly too. Some officers who had simply had access to the compromised operations found themselves under a cloud of suspicion. Their careers quietly stalled while the real explanation sat undiscovered. Others on the task force clung to the belief that the losses had to be explained by a technical failure, a compromised communication system, rather than a human traitor, because the alternative was almost too uncomfortable to accept. That someone they trusted, someone who ate lunch in the same cafeteria and complained about the same budget cuts, was responsible. That reluctance to suspect one of their own bought Ames years of additional cover. Meanwhile, Ames wasn't being especially careful about hiding his new wealth. He bought a house in Arlington, Virginia, for around $540,000, paid largely in cash. At a time when his CIA salary was still in the government pay scale range of a mid-level officer, he drove an expensive Jaguar. He wore custom suits and got expensive dental work done. He and Rosario spent lavishly on furniture, jewelry, and imported goods. To colleagues, some of this seemed odd, and there were murmurs, but in an agency culture that didn't yet have systematic financial disclosure or auditing for officers at his level, murmurs weren't enough to trigger a real investigation. Ames later admitted that his sudden wealth was, in hindsight, an obvious red flag, the kind of thing a competent counterintelligence officer, like himself, would have flagged immediately in someone else. The system simply wasn't looking closely enough at its own people, and Ames knew that better than almost anyone, because building and enforcing that kind of scrutiny had, at times, literally been part of his job description. For years, this arrangement held. Ames continued reporting to work, continued having access to sensitive material even as he moved between assignments, and continued passing what he could to his Soviet, and later Russian, handlers through. Dead drops around the Washington area, chalk marks on mailboxes, packages left in wooded parks, a system built specifically so that no single meeting would expose the relationship. He was, by CIA standards, not a particularly gifted operative. But because of who he was and where he sat, he didn't need to be gifted. He needed to be trusted, and he was. The break in the case came slowly, and it came from doing the boring, grinding work that counterintelligence actually depends on. In late 1991, with the mole hunt still unresolved, the CIA formed a small internal unit specifically tasked with finding the leak, and by 1992, that effort merged into a joint task force with the FBI. Investigators went back through years of records, cross-referencing which officers had access to which compromised operations, trying to narrow an enormous field of possible suspects down to a manageable list. Ames's name kept surfacing. His financial history, once investigators finally started pulling his bank records, made no sense against his declared income. He deposited large sums in patterns that didn't match any plausible legitimate source. By 1993, the FBI had Ames under close physical and electronic surveillance. They searched his trash. They tracked his movements. They eventually obtained warrants to search his house and his car while he was away, finding documents and evidence linking him directly to Soviet, and by then Russian, intelligence. They confirmed what the financial records had suggested. Ames was living a double life and had been for close to 9 years. The surveillance operation itself had to be conducted with extraordinary care. Ames was, after all, a trained counterintelligence officer who understood exactly what FBI surveillance looked like from the inside. Agents watched him meet contacts, tracked his travel, and monitored communications, all while making sure nothing tipped him off that the net was closing. They watched him make chalk marks near his home, a signal to his handlers that a package was ready at a prearranged site. They documented trips abroad where he was suspected of meeting Russian intelligence officers directly. Piece by piece, the case against him became undeniable, and by the start of 1994, investigators were simply waiting for the right moment to move. On February 21, 1994, FBI agents arrested Aldrich Ames outside his home in Arlington, Virginia, as he was leaving for what he thought was a routine day at CIA headquarters. His wife, Rosario, who had known about and participated in the arrangement, was arrested as well. Both were charged with espionage. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Bank records, surveillance footage, physical evidence recovered from their home, and eventually Ames's own admissions. On April 28, 1994, Aldrich Ames pleaded guilty to espionage and tax evasion. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rosario Ames pleaded guilty to related charges and received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation, in part because of concerns about the welfare of their young son. As part of the plea agreement, the government seized what remained of the money the Ameses had accumulated, and several $100,000 was eventually directed to a fund for victims of crime. It's worth pausing on just how quickly the damage compounded. This wasn't a single betrayal that cost a single life. It was a cascading failure. When one asset disappeared, Soviet counterintelligence could sometimes work backward from the circumstances of that arrest to identify still more sources, and CIA officers scrambling to protect remaining operations occasionally made decisions under pressure and without knowing a mole was the cause that inadvertently exposed even more. Ames didn't just hand over a list of names. He set off a chain reaction that the CIA itself, still operating blind to the real cause, sometimes worsened while trying to contain it. The human cost of what Ames did is the part of this story that numbers alone can't fully capture. At least 10 men who had risked everything to work against their own governments were executed. Others spent years in Soviet prisons. Entire intelligence networks that had taken a decade or more to build, developed by officers who had earned trust person by person, meeting by meeting, were destroyed within months of Ames's first approach to the Soviets. Some of those networks were never rebuilt. The CIA's ability to understand what was happening inside the Soviet Union, and later Russia, during a period of enormous global change, was badly and lastingly damaged, right at the moment that understanding mattered most. The Ames case forced a reckoning inside American intelligence that went far beyond one man's punishment. Congress held hearings. The CIA's Inspector General produced a scathing internal report criticizing the agency's failure to notice obvious warning signs for years: the unexplained wealth, the erratic behavior, the lifestyle far outside what his salary could support. In the aftermath, the CIA overhauled how it vets and monitors its own employees. Financial disclosure requirements were tightened. Polygraph and background reinvestigation procedures were strengthened. Internal security and counterintelligence functions that had operated with a surprising degree of institutional trust were rebuilt around the idea that trust has to be verified continuously, not granted once and assumed forever. It's not an exaggeration to say that modern American intelligence community security culture, the routine reinvestigations, the financial monitoring, the internal red teaming of its own staff, exists in large part because of what Aldrich Ames proved was possible. There's a particular kind of unease that sits at the center of this case, separate from the espionage itself. It's the fact that the man responsible for one of the most damaging betrayals in American intelligence history wasn't some outsider who slipped through a crack in the system. He was placed at the very center of it, specifically because the system trusted him to guard against exactly what he was doing. For 9 years, the CIA searched for its traitor using tools, procedures, and in some cases the direct input of the traitor himself. Aldrich Ames didn't beat American counterintelligence through brilliance. He beat it because no one thought to look hard enough at the person whose job was to look. And that, more than the money, more than the house, more than the arrest itself, is the detail this case leaves behind, the reminder that the most dangerous blind spot in any system built on trust is the person everyone has already decided not to suspect.